I have always found pictures like these very unnerving. Maybe you do too. They are particularly unnerving when they show children. It seems so out of place for the innocence of youth to be swept along with little understanding into imitating the rigid rituals used to whip up adult fervor. Yes, when I first saw these two photos, they made my tummy sink a little. Maybe it'll make your tummy sink a little when you understand that these photos from 1942 aren't from Europe. They aren't of crowds of Hitler youth and cheering Germans shouting Heil Hitler. They are from schoolyards in the good old USA. And therein lies a story you may not have heard about one of the most influential legacies of a famous World's Fair held in Chicago in 1893. In 1890, the U.S. Congress agreed to sponsor a splendiferous World's Fair to be dubbed the Columbian Exposition, scheduled to coincide with the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the New World on October 12, 1492. A vast theme park-like venue with massive but temporary white neoclassical buildings, beautiful surroundings, huge scientific, agricultural, business, and cultural exhibitions, and many other attractions was to be constructed along the shore of Lake Michigan at the edge of Chicago. Those huge white buildings gave the fairgrounds its nickname, the White City. Remember the words in the song America the Beautiful? Thine alabaster cities gleam, undimmed by human tears. Alabaster is a valuable substance, most typically white, often used for marble-like carvings, like this delicate alabaster lily. An alabaster city would be one that looks just like this picture of the fairgrounds, pristine and white buildings gleaming in the sunshine. In fact, that white city you see here is the very one that inspired Catherine Lee Bates, author of America the Beautiful, to write the words in that stanza. On a train trip from Boston to Colorado in 1893, she had passed amber waves of grain and purple mountains. But before that, she passed by Chicago and had seen the White City. During the 6 months that the fair was open to visitors, it became famous for introducing to the general public all kinds of new things, many of them still around after 125 years. That included, as examples, Pabst Blue Ribbon beer, gold medal flour, Aunt Jemima pancake mix, cream of wheat with its own spokesman, a fellow named Rastus, juicy fruit chewing gum, elongated souvenir pennies you could make yourself on a machine, just as you still can at tourist destinations today, and even the first dishwashing machine, a hand-powered innovation created by female inventor Josephine Cochran, whose grandfather John Fitch had invented the first practical steamboat in the 1780s. Her washing machine production company eventually became part of the KitchenAid Company, which eventually became part of the Whirlpool Corporation. Oh, and then there was the original Ferris wheel. Yes, the one invented by Mr. Ferris. At the Paris Exposition in 1889, the centerpiece had been the amazing tower designed by Mr. Eiffel. The Columbian Exposition planners solicited ideas for some sort of similar architectural marvel as a centerpiece for their fair, and George Ferris came in with the winning idea. It was to be a gigantic thrill ride, which also gave riders a fantastic view of the whole fair. Unlike later county and state fair types of Ferris wheels you are likely familiar with, that have swinging seats, each holding 3 or 4 people, the original Ferris wheel at the Columbian Exposition was a whirling monster as high as a 20-story building, with 36 passenger cars that each could hold up to 60 people. I've long had a fascination with researching the history of America's World's Fairs, and the first one that caught my attention was that groundbreaking Columbian Exposition, where so many innovations were introduced. Early on in my research about the Columbian Exposition and its era, I came across a reference to the name of a Victorian science fiction book titled Looking Backward that was first published in 1888, just 2 years before the preparations for the Great Chicago Fair began. It sounded fascinating, so I bought a copy. Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, was a utopian science fiction novel written by Edward Bellamy, a lawyer and writer from Massachusetts, who also happened to be what we would now refer to as a socialist. Just as now the terms socialist and socialism carried with them a lot of negative baggage in many Americans' minds back then. Bellamy realized the American public in the 1880s tended to envision socialism as an idea promoted by foreigners who had lax sexual morals and who were atheists at best and downright hostile to religion at worst. So even though his theories on politics and economics were almost identical to those of most socialists of his time, he deliberately chose to avoid giving a bad first impression to people by using a different term. He called himself a nationalist. But he didn't mean by that what is meant by the term nationalist these days. It referred instead to the idea of nationalization of industry and the economy as opposed to capitalism. Bellamy's book, Looking Backward, described a vision of what U.S. society could become by the year 2000 and embodied Bellamy's socialist theories. In its heyday, Edward Bellamy's book was the third largest bestseller of its time, right after Uncle Tom's Cabin and Ben-Hur, and issued in both hardcover and paperback editions. It created such a stir among intellectuals of that day that it almost immediately created a political mass movement that lasted for several years. In the U.S. alone, over 160 so-called Bellamy clubs sprang up where enthusiasts could discuss Bellamy's ideas and plan how to spread them throughout society. The official magazine of the movement was called The Nationalist. The novel has been translated over the years into more than 20 languages, from Spanish to German to Chinese. The premise of the book is sort of like the Rip Van Winkle story. Bostonian Julian West falls asleep in 1887 and wakes up in the year 2000. Other authors from Bellamy's era also wrote futuristic visions. Jules Verne had written From the Earth to the Moon over 20 years earlier, in 1865, and H.G. Wells was soon to write The Time Machine in 1895. But Bellamy's story doesn't focus on the gadgets of the future so much as on the society of the future. Julian West finds that during his 213-year nap, the U.S. has been transformed into a socialist utopia. The book has very little real plot. The text just follows him around as his host introduces him to his new environment, explaining to him what changes have occurred in U.S. society since he fell asleep in 1887 and what brought them about. This includes drastically reduced working hours for people performing menial jobs. Everyone retires with full benefits at age 45. Most people live in the equivalent of townhouses or elaborate apartment buildings with central kitchens where communal meals are prepared by professional cooks. The productive capacity of America is nationally owned, and the goods of society are equally distributed to all citizens. A credit card is issued every year to every member of American society. Yes, that is the term Bellamy came up with clear back in 1887, although in practice it was actually what we would now call a debit card. He couldn't imagine computers at the time, so his card system was much more primitive than that of today, but its use worked on the same general principles. At the beginning of each year, every person is given a certain amount of credit, the same amount to each one, that he can budget to use throughout the year to buy whatever he wants at the public storehouses found in every community. These storehouses are much like giant Sam's Club stores of today, carrying everything from clothes to food to furniture. A clerk at the storehouse punches out little holes on his cardboard card that correspond to the value of what he has chosen on each shopping trip. All of these things reflected author Bellamy's aspirations for how he thought things ought to be, giving him an opportunity to enumerate all the evils of his own era in American society of the 1880s, and explain how his theories, put into practice, could make for a better world. Yes, Edward Bellamy was a socialist. But the main focus of our story for this video isn't about Edward Bellamy. It is about his cousin, Francis Bellamy, who was also a socialist, but a slightly different kind. He was what was referred to at the time as a Christian socialist, combining socialist political and economic theories with an emphasis on biblical values. Edward and Francis worked together on many socialist projects. Francis had been a Baptist minister, using his pulpit to give sermons that championed the rights of working people and the equal distribution of economic resources. He was convinced these things were inherent in the teachings of Jesus. In 1891, he was forced from his Boston pulpit because of his socialist leanings. He had begun openly describing Jesus as a socialist, and at one point gave a series of lectures on the socialism of the primitive church. He gave up being a minister and eventually stopped attending church altogether after moving to Florida, reportedly because he was disgusted with the racism he witnessed there in the churches. In 1892, at the height of the Bellamy movement in the U.S., Francis Bellamy was working for a popular magazine aimed at youths and families titled The Youth's Companion. With a circulation of 450,000, it was one of the largest circulation publications of its type in the country. In spite of its title, it targeted adults as well as children, with pieces contributed by such famous writers as Harriet Beecher Stowe, Mark Twain, Booker T. Washington, and Jack London. The owner was Daniel Ford, who had previously been a member of Francis Bellamy's Boston Baptist congregation and who supported Francis's Christian socialist ideas. Daniel Ford's nephew, James Upham, was head of the magazine's premium department. Premiums were given to individuals or groups for signing up new subscribers or getting old subscribers to renew. A yearly catalog, much like the later Sears and Roebuck catalogs, had pictures and descriptions of the premiums that could be earned. The list was long, everything from singing canaries to egg-laying hens, microscopes to sewing machines, toys to dinnerware and clothes and furniture, and books by famous authors like Shakespeare and Dickens. Around 1888, Upham came up with the idea to encourage public schools across the land to display the U.S. flag daily, either on an upright flagpole in the schoolyard or on a flagstaff projecting from the building. Up until this point, the only institutions that regularly flew the flag daily were military installations. Conveniently, the Companion's premium department was prepared to sell flags of all kinds and sizes, including the perfect sizes to display for such a purpose. And thus the magazine launched ads for a school flag movement. Its goal was supposedly not just to sell flags, but also to raise the level of patriotism among school children. In one ad, students were urged to send for 100 cards that had imprinted on them, "This certificate entitles the holder thereof to one share in the patriotic influence of a flag over the schoolhouse." Just like Girl Scouts sell cookies to raise money for projects nowadays, back then, if the pupils at a school could get 100 friends and relatives to buy a flag certificate for 10 cents each, they would accumulate the $10 necessary to send to the premium department of Youth's Companion magazine to buy a flag just the right size to unfurl over their own school building. It was a very successful venture. Almost 25,000 schools across the land bought the American flag from the premium department in 1891 alone. But Upham wasn't going to be satisfied until every school in the country had its own flag. To promote the idea even further, he solicited the endorsement of the National Education Association and the U.S. government. And he came up with the perfect advertising gimmick to link to the flag project. The Youth's Companion magazine would spearhead creating a national public school celebration that would feature a patriotic program to be held simultaneously in schools all across the U.S. It would be linked to the opening of the Columbian Exposition on Columbus Day, October 12, 1892. He was able to persuade the organizers of the fair to plan to include the same school program in that day's observances at the fairgrounds. But it had become clear by early 1892 that the exposition building plans were going to take longer to complete than the organizers had originally allowed for. There would be no way to get everything in the splendiferous White City, including the great Ferris wheel, ready for grand opening in 1892. Still, work had progressed far enough by October 1892 for an official dedication ceremony to be held on October 21st, while work continued so that the fair could hold an official grand opening to the public in May 1893. And thus, the fair organizers agreed that one of the centerpieces of that October 21st ceremony would be the National Public School celebration. And that's where Francis Bellamy enters our story again. Upham and the people helping him plan the ceremony, that was eventually described in detail in the September 8th edition of the magazine and distributed nationwide, envisioned the ceremony would everywhere feature a flag raising, followed by every group of children reciting a pledge to the flag. Upham wasn't having success in coming up with the wording for that pledge, so he solicited the help of his friend and co-worker Francis with crafting just the right wording for the occasion. Yes, Francis Bellamy, Christian Socialist, was the author of the pledge. In its original form, used at the nationwide ceremony that year, it read, "I pledge allegiance to my flag and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." Francis had long been a student of the French Revolution, and while composing the wording for the pledge, he had considered including the slogan of that revolution, which would have been rendered in English as liberty, equality, fraternity. But it is said that he realized that many among the Southern contingent of superintendents and teachers who were supporting the program might be offended and probably balk at the use of the words equality and fraternity as applying to African Americans. So he backpedaled and stuck with just liberty and justice. I must admit I find it somewhat amusing that most Americans don't realize that the author of the pledge was envisioning that the flag stood for a socialist republic when he penned the words that they now recite. And, by the way, Francis Bellamy, author of the pledge, deliberately did not include any reference to God in his version of the pledge to be used in the public schools, as he was a believer in the absolute separation of church and state. James Upham himself came up with the idea that a ritual gesture, a salute to the flag, would be needed for use with the pledge, and he evidently choreographed that gesture. In the official program for the celebration, Bellamy provided the description for this salute, which for many years was dubbed the Bellamy Salute, as it was connected with the pledge written by Bellamy. At a signal from the principal, the pupils, in ordered ranks, hands to the side, face the flag. Another signal is given. Every pupil gives the flag the military salute, right hand lifted, palm downward to align with the forehead and close to it. Standing thus, all repeat together slowly, "I pledge allegiance to my flag and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." At the words, "to my flag," the right hand is extended gracefully, palm upward toward the flag, and remains in this gesture till the end of the affirmation, whereupon all hands immediately drop to the side. The campaign was a rousing success, and hundreds of thousands of children across America joined their voices in the pledge for the first time on October 21, 1892, at the same time as the ceremony proceeded at the grounds of the Columbian Exposition. Bellamy and Upham were there to lead the pledge, while hundreds of schoolgirls dressed in red, white, and blue formed a living flag. And just like the introduction of Aunt Jemima pancake mix or blue ribbon beer at the same fair, the Pledge of Allegiance, introduced at the Columbian Exposition, was destined to still be in use 125 years later. The ritual was so well received that most schools continued the practice to start their day from then on, and have continued right on into the 21st century. And so here you have it, the new salute to the flag in schools as it was seen across the land, captured, for instance, in this ceremony in 1915. Or offered by this group of Negro children at their own segregated school in 1900. Or by these children in the 1930s. Or by the students in these two groups from undated photographs. These last two undated photos, like those earlier 1942 photos included at the beginning of this video, would have to have been taken before December 1942. Because by that point, too many Americans were noticing the painfully obvious similarity between the Nazi salute, seen in so many photos and newsreels in American theaters and newspapers, and the Bellamy salute. The U.S. Congress amended the flag code on December 22, 1942, to replace the stiff-arm salute with the hand-over-the-heart salute for civilians. Although evidently word didn't get around about this decision very effectively, this headline shows it took New York State schools until June 1943 to get around to making the change. Yes, American citizens surely wouldn't want the world to think that they were anything like the hated Nazis. America was a land of liberty and justice for all, where the rights of every individual were respected and guarded carefully. Those rights included, in particular, the four freedoms, as described by President Franklin Roosevelt in his State of the Union speech to Congress on January 6, 1941. Norman Rockwell later enshrined those four freedoms in an iconic collection of paintings made for the Saturday Evening Post magazine. The paintings were even used on posters urging Americans to buy war bonds. Roosevelt insisted these four were essential human rights that should be universally protected, and they were eventually included in the Charter of the United Nations. But of course, these rights were totally flouted in Nazi Germany during the era leading up to and including the war years, especially when it came to the Jews of Germany. Shortly after Hitler came to power, the stripping of the rights and protections of the law for Jews began. In 1933, books by Jews were burned. Random attacks on Jews and Jewish property began. Police and courts no longer protected Jews, and boycotts of Jewish shops began. By 1936, German citizenship was denied to all Jews. Jews were banned from parks, restaurants, and swimming pools, and passports for them to travel abroad were severely restricted. Strangely enough, they weren't even allowed to own electrical or optical equipment, bicycles, typewriters, or records. By 1938, Jews had to carry special identity cards. They were excluded from movie theaters, concerts, beaches, and resorts. Jewish children were expelled from German schools. And on November 9, 1938, ever after known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, Jews and their property were viciously attacked by civilian rioters and Nazi paramilitary forces across Germany and Austria. Over 7,000 Jewish businesses were damaged or destroyed. Hundreds of Jews were killed or seriously injured. Jewish homes, hospitals, and schools were ransacked, many of them demolished with sledgehammers. The rampage destroyed 267 synagogues. And 30,000 Jewish men, including those shown here, were arrested and sent to concentration camps. By 1941, all Jews over 6, and even younger in some places, were forced to wear a yellow Star of David with Jew written on it. They were forbidden to use public phones, forbidden to keep dogs, cats, or birds, and were forbidden to leave the country. Yes, the citizens of the United States of America certainly didn't want to be using a salute to the grand old stars and stripes that might mistakenly connect them in any way with the evil Nazi regime and its crushing of human rights. There was just one tiny problem. And it involved the American Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. The problem was that some individuals and groups of American citizens had a problem of conscience regarding reciting that pledge. Some had a personal conviction that the Bible forbade them from pledging allegiance to anyone or anything other than the Creator God. To do so would be a form of blasphemy. And some were also convinced that the ritual of raising your arm and saluting the flag and pledging allegiance to it went against the commandment in the Ten Commandments that forbade crafting an object and performing rituals of honor toward it. They considered that would be a form of idolatry. This concern wasn't without some sound reasons. By the time that the Youth's Companion had come up with the Pledge of Allegiance, the Grand Army of the Republic, a Civil War veterans organization, had been campaigning for several years to get a flag in every schoolroom in America. At a rally for this project in 1889, the organization's commander-in-chief, William Warner, had enthusiastically declared, "The reverence of schoolchildren for the flag should be like that of the Israelites for the Ark of the Covenant." Yes, some people had what certainly seemed to be legitimate concerns of religion and conscience about flag rituals. And yet, at the same time, there have long been many individuals and groups who have considered saluting the flag and reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to it, and even taking part in periodic ostentatious displays of the flag, to be an absolute requirement to prove true patriotism. These folks have considered refusal to salute the flag and say the pledge as possible evidence that someone was unpatriotic at best and an evil traitor to the country at worst. These two groups came head to head in 1935. In that year, the international head of the religious group known as the Jehovah's Witnesses, Judge Joseph Rutherford, declared dogmatically at a major annual convention in the U.S. that indeed a witness's only allegiance should be to the Creator. He further emphasized that rituals involving honoring national symbols like flags were a form of idolatry. The authority, power, and influence of Rutherford over the members of the Jehovah's Witness organization was similar to that of the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. His interpretation of the Bible on any debatable topic was considered by members to be the final word on any matter. The organization's publication arm, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, printed a booklet titled Loyalty, outlining the stand Rutherford and the organization's central headquarters was making on these matters related to pledging allegiance to nations and participating in civic rituals involving giving honor to national symbols. As word spread of Rutherford's pronouncement, devout witness families in the United States began teaching their children that they would be dishonoring God by taking part in the Pledge of Allegiance at school. The hundreds of thousands of individuals in the U.S. and other parts of the world who were part of the Jehovah's Witness movement of that time were utterly convinced that they were living in what they called the last days, that ancient prophecies of the Bible about a time of great tribulation were about to be fulfilled in the world, and that only those who were totally faithful to the commands of the Bible, as interpreted by witness teachings, would be protected during the soon-coming horrific Battle of Armageddon. Thus, this matter of not committing blasphemy and idolatry was not just a matter of intellectual theology to them. It was a matter of actual physical life and death. At the same time, there was no doubt from 1935 and onward, the world was indeed gearing up toward a major widespread war in Europe. Even though President Roosevelt reassured the nation in 1935 that the U.S. did not plan to get involved in the European war as it did in World War I, everyone knew plans could change. As the hostilities increased in Europe, many Americans were worried about where the U.S. fit in the conflicts, and concerns and conspiracy theories about patriotism and spies and traitors were rampant. And thus came the inevitable clashes between the two groups regarding the Pledge of Allegiance. One example of this is the story of the family of Walter Gobitis. In 1935, Walter was a recent convert to the Jehovah's Witnesses, and he brought his family into the organization with him, including his children Lillian, born in 1923, and Billy, born in 1925. As you probably realize, even today the Jehovah's Witnesses are well known for zealously going door to door in order to attempt to share their beliefs with others, offering printed literature such as the Watchtower and Awake magazines, and being quite assertive in attempts to get people to listen to their witnessing for their faith. They do this, of course, because they really do believe that what they are doing might save someone from having to suffer horrifically during a coming time of great tribulation. But those on the receiving end often aren't grateful for the effort, viewing them as the equivalent of unsolicited telemarketers today. Well, back in the 1930s, they were encouraged by their organization's leadership to be even more persistent and much more public in their efforts than most are now. They preached and offered literature on downtown sidewalks and city streets. By 1933, they were using sound trucks to broadcast phonograph recordings of short messages from Rutherford to the public by loudspeakers. And by 1934, the organization had made available portable record players to members, so they could knock on doors and offer to play a record of a 4.5-minute mini message by Rutherford to people right on their own front porches. Thus, they got a reputation for being a public nuisance in some towns and cities. Factor that into the equation, along with their resistance to the civic ritual of the Pledge of Allegiance, and you have a recipe for a crisis. Which brings us back to the Gobitis family of Minersburg, Pennsylvania. Young Lillian was baptized into the witness faith in May of 1935, and like all other converts was expected to go door to door to spread the faith. So one day that summer she was among a group of 40 witnesses who were going door to door in New Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 10 miles from home. Police received a number of nuisance complaints. A mob was forming around the group of witnesses, and so the police rounded up the witnesses and put them in cells in the firehouse, supposedly to protect them. 11-year-old Lillian was punched by a mob member during the fracas. The mob grew to several hundred, trying to break down the doors of the firehouse before the police were able to disperse the angry crowd and escort the witnesses safely out of town. When school opened in the fall of 1935, Lillian and Billy, trying to sincerely follow the beliefs that they had been taught at home, agreed with one another that they would not salute the flag or recite the Pledge of Allegiance at school. But when the time came, Lillian raised her arm and mouthed the words to the pledge. "I was chicken," she later explained. Lillian was a popular straight-A student and had been elected president of her 7th grade class. She was afraid if she stopped participating in the pledge, she would lose all of that. As circumstances later proved, she was right. But in spite of that worry, she said she felt incredibly guilty at the time. On October 22nd, Billy came home from school and announced, "I stopped saluting the flag. The teacher tried to put up my arm, but I held on to my pocket." Yes, you heard that right. The teacher tried to physically force this young boy to give the stiff-armed salute to the U.S. flag. Inspired by Billy's courage, Lillian quietly told her teacher before class the next morning that she would have to stop saluting the flag because it went against her faith. "We can't have any other gods before Jehovah God," she said. Her teacher was more compassionate than Billy's had been. She hugged Lillian and told her it would be okay. When the rest of the class stood to salute the flag, Lillian sat in her seat and remained silent. Lillian later recalled, "Soon everyone was staring at me, but I felt elated." So what happened then? She had been right to be concerned. Some classmates mocked her, some shunned her, and some did worse. When I'd come to school, she said, they would throw a hail of pebbles and yell things like, "Here comes Jehovah." Some were just curious and asked her about her reasons for what she did. A few of her best friends stood by her through the situation. For 2 weeks, Lillian and Billy refused to salute the flag, and yet school authorities did nothing, although private citizens did. Billy was beaten up by schoolmates, and the family was jeered on the street in Minersville. But the hard-headed, hard-hearted, and hard-nosed superintendent of the Minersville School District, Charles Rutherford, wasn't about to have such behavior tolerated in his schools. He asked the State Department of Public Instruction for authority to punish the Gobitis children. They granted him the authority, and thus he shortly called a school board meeting to adopt a rule that the pledge and flag salute would be mandatory for all students. Walter Gobitis appeared at the meeting to argue against adoption of the rule. "We are not desecrating the flag," he said. "We show no disrespect for the flag, but cannot salute it. The Bible tells us this, and we must obey." Both Lillian and Billy Gobitis wrote letters to the school board expressing in their own words their reasons for their actions. "I do not salute the flag because I have promised to do the will of God," wrote Billy. "Jehovah is my God, and the Bible is my creed. I try my best to obey the Creator," wrote Lillian. But the resistance was futile. The rule was adopted, and minutes later, Lillian and Billy were expelled from the Minersville school. And it didn't end there. A local Catholic church started a boycott of the family store, and its business dropped off. After their expulsion, their father eventually had to pay for them to enroll in a private school, resulting in even more economic hardship. Walter filed a complaint with the Federal District Court in Philadelphia, alleging that the expulsion of the children violated their right to free exercise of their religion and to be free of cruel and unusual punishment. During the trial, Lillian and Billy both testified, sharing a number of Bible verses in support of their refusal to take part in the pledge. Superintendent Raudebusch testified and adamantly called the views of the Gobitis children perverted. He claimed they had been indoctrinated, telling the judge, "As I see it, Your Honor, I feel that this is not a matter of religion at all. It has nothing to do with religion." The judge was unimpressed with Roudebush's claims, and in the end sided with the Gobitis family, stating in his decision, "The refusal of these two earnest Christian children to salute the flag cannot even remotely prejudice or imperil the safety, health, morals, property, or personal rights of their fellows." He congratulated Lillian and Billy on their sincerity and their sturdy independence of thought and action, and called the school policy utterly alien to the genius and spirit of our nation. But Roudebush would not back down. The school board appealed to the federal Third Circuit Court of Appeals, and meanwhile the Gobitis children were unable to return to school. Their parents attempted homeschooling for a few weeks, but Roudebush literally threatened to classify the children as rebellious juvenile delinquents, take them from their family, and send them to reform school if they weren't taught by a qualified teacher. So Walter eventually organized an official small private school for his own children and children from other witness families. In 1939, the appeals court affirmed the lower court decision, deciding once again in favor of the Gobitis family. That should have been the end of the situation, but hostile Superintendent Roudebush, along with the school board, refused to relent and appealed to the United States Supreme Court, which agreed in March 1940 to take up the case. The Supreme Court would have the final word. From 1935 to 1940, many children from Jehovah's Witness families all across the nation had been subject to ridicule at best and being expelled from school at worst for refusing to say the pledge. These news clippings from the New York Times during that period are just a few samples of some of the families affected in the Northeast. The situation also affected teachers who were Jehovah's Witnesses, as they also refused to say the pledge. They lost their jobs. So in early 1940, many folks were waiting with held breath to see what the Supreme Court would say. On June 3, 1940, the shocking decision was announced. In an 8-1 ruling, the Supreme Court had decided to overturn the federal appeals court decision. They declared that public schools did indeed have a constitutional right to demand that all students stand and salute the flag and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. They further declared that school systems could inflict a penalty on any children who refused to participate, up to and including expelling them from school. Justice Felix Frankfurter provided the reasoning of the majority decision in the case. Frankfurt insisted the school district's interest in creating national unity was enough to allow them to require students to salute the flag. The nation needed loyalty and the unity of all the people. Saluting the flag was a primary means of achieving this legitimate goal. Allowing any children to refuse to participate in the ritual of the pledge as a matter of conscience could threaten the security of the United States. The social need for conformity with the requirement was greater than the individual liberty claims of the Jehovah's Witnesses. The recitation of a pledge advanced the cause of patriotism in the United States. The country's foundation as a free society depended upon building sentimental ties. A required pledge in the schools was necessary to promote in the minds of children who attend the common schools an attachment to the institutions of their country. The lone dissident voice on the court, Justice Harlan Stone, wrote a strongly worded dissenting opinion, arguing that forcing students to say the pledge did indeed violate their freedom of speech and religion guaranteed by the First Amendment. He further insisted that the reasoning that this violation of the rights of a religious minority was necessary in order to maintain the unity and safety of the country was ridiculous. His opinion was ignored at best and ridiculed at worst. Once the ruling was announced on June 3rd, its repercussions across the land were almost immediate. Many Americans were inclined to believe in vigilante justice for these traitors. Shockingly, many in the American public took this ruling to be much more than a ruling on school requirements. They took it to be a declaration by the U.S. government that those of any age who were part of Jehovah's Witnesses were not only unpatriotic, but were attempting to undermine the country's war efforts and were very likely traitors and maybe even spies, since the court had said that their practice of refusing to recite the pledge was a danger to national security. On June 9th, less than a week after the decision was announced, a mob of 2,500 set the Witnesses' Kingdom Hall in Kennebunkport, Maine on fire, leaving only its exterior walls standing when the fire was out. On June 16th, Litchfield, Illinois witnesses were pulled from their cars and beaten, their cars were destroyed, and police jailed all of that town's 60 witnesses, ostensibly to protect them from their neighbors. And on it went throughout the summer in every section of the country. A sample of snippets from news stories. Sanford, Maine, 2 witnesses were beaten by a crowd of 1,000. Rawlins, Wyoming, townspeople brutally beat 5 witnesses. Flagstaff, Arizona, a witness was accosted by 3 men who insisted he salute the flag. They beat him unconscious and dragged him across the street to a flag. When he came to, they insisted again that he salute. He was so dazed at that point, all he remembered was a large crowd gathering and screaming, "Nazi spy! String him up! Chop his head off!" Parco, Wyoming, a witness was tarred and feathered by townspeople. Nebraska, a witness was lured from his home, drug away, and castrated. Little Rock, Arkansas, witnesses were beaten with pipes and screwdrivers. Odessa, Texas, witnesses were herded into a local jail, beaten, and called Nazi spies. The next morning, about 75 witnesses were loaded into a truck, dropped off at the county line, and told by the sheriff to start walking. Much of the persecution was organized and perpetrated by members of the American Legion, over 100 vigilante episodes nationwide by some reports. One of the worst assaults was in Richwood, West Virginia, on June 29th. A group of witnesses went to the mayor's office and tried to explain that they had not been disseminating communist literature as rumor had it. Instead of listening to them, the mayor called fellow members of the American Legion to let them know he, quote, had the damn sons of bitches, and to come join him. When the Legionnaires assembled, a deputy sheriff took off his badge and said, "What is done from here on will not be done in the name of the law." He tied the hands of each witness and then bound them together in a human rope chain. Each of the witnesses was forced to drink large amounts of castor oil, a strong laxative that would give them severe diarrhea, enough to require later hospitalization for several who began urinating blood. They were then marched through a jeering mob to the post office, where the witnesses refused to salute the flag. Still roped together, they were marched to their boarding house to pick up their belongings. A crowd of more than 500 people followed. The march then continued to their cars. The cars had been doused with castor oil, and swastikas and the words Fifth Column were painted on the cars' sides. One Southern sheriff told a reporter why witnesses were being run out of his town. "They're traitors. The Supreme Court says so. Ain't you heard?" The American Civil Liberties Union reported to the Justice Department that nearly 1,500 witnesses were physically attacked in more than 300 communities nationwide. An ACLU booklet published in early 1941 includes testimony from many Jehovah's Witnesses, both white and black, who had endured terrorism and physical violence in the vigilante outpouring after the Supreme Court ruling in 1940. Their vivid stories are identical in nature to the type of racist terrorism and physical violence inflicted on African Americans in the 19th century and first half of the 20th century. This was not the result that the Supreme Court justices had in mind when they made their ruling. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt appealed publicly for calm, and in a radio fireside chat, President Roosevelt denounced the violence. Although the widespread violence calmed down somewhat by the end of that year, resentment against the witnesses continued simmering under the surface. After Pearl Harbor, the issue of patriotism became even more strongly inflamed, and violence continued to break out on occasion. One of the strangest and most ironic aspects of this situation was the common allegation that the Jehovah's Witnesses were Nazis or Nazi sympathizers. Remember the swastikas painted on their cars in West Virginia when they were run out of town? What all of the folks making those accusations did not know was this: Jehovah's Witnesses suffered religious persecution in Nazi Germany between 1933 and 1945 after refusing to perform military service, join Nazi organizations, or give allegiance to the Hitler regime. An estimated 10,000 witnesses, half of the number of members in Germany during that period, were imprisoned, including 2,000 who were sent to Nazi concentration camps. An estimated 1,200 died in custody, including 250 who were executed. They were the first Christian denomination banned by the Nazi government in 1933 and the most extensively and intensively persecuted. Unlike Jews and other racial minorities who were persecuted on the basis of their ethnicity, Jehovah's Witnesses could escape persecution and personal harm and be released immediately by renouncing their religious beliefs. All they needed to do was sign this document indicating renouncement of their faith, submission to state authority, and support of the German military. Almost none did so. Yes, Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany, far from being Nazis or Nazi sympathizers, refused to give the stiff-armed Heil Hitler salute and pledge allegiance to the Third Reich. For the same reason they resisted saluting the U.S. flag with a stiff-armed salute and pledging allegiance to it. They believed their only allegiance should be pledged to the Creator. Their punishment for this refusal at first was being shunned from the regular activities of society. Just like the Jews, by 1933 they were refused civil service jobs. In 1934, witness teachers were fired if they did not renounce the religion. By 1936, witnesses were removed from all German companies, and those who were self-employed were denied professional or business licenses. The state confiscated motor vehicles and bicycles used by witnesses for their business, withdrew driver's license, withdrew pensions, and evicted witnesses from their homes. More brutal methods of punishment began to be applied from 1936 onward, including horsewhipping, prolonged daily beatings, the torture of family members, and the threat of shooting. Some witnesses were placed in mental institutions and subjected to psychiatric treatment. Sterilization was ordered for some deemed to be stubborn in their refusal to denounce their religion. And then they came for the children. School children were required to sing Nazi songs and salute the Nazi flag at the beginning of the day, give the Hitler salute, and take part in ceremonies honoring Hitler. Those who refused were ridiculed and sometimes beaten by teachers and shunned or beaten by classmates. Many were expelled. From March 3, 1936 onward, Nazi authorities began breaking up families as authorities took children away from their witness parents and sent them to reform schools, orphanages, or private homes to be brought up as Nazis. Can you begin to see the chilling similarity between what was happening to witness children in Germany and what happened to the Gobitis children and many other children from witness families across the U.S. at virtually the same time? The three Opelowski children shown here, ages 10, 12, and 13, were also expelled from school in 1935 in Massachusetts for refusing to recite the pledge. The Daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR, called for the family to be deported. Instead, the father was fined and the judge sentenced the children to be locked up in reform school on juvenile delinquency charges. And the superintendent of the Minersville, Pennsylvania school system made a similar threat that he had the power to send the Gobitis children away to reform school. Meanwhile, back in Germany, after the outbreak of war in August 1939, more serious punishments were applied to Jehovah's Witnesses. A decree went out that any refusal to perform military service or encouragement to others to refuse such service was punishable by death. Between August 1939 and September 1940, 152 Jehovah's Witnesses appeared before the highest military court of the Wehrmacht, charged with demoralization of the armed forces, and 112 were executed, usually by beheading. This is a photo of Helene Gotthold with her two children, Gerd and Gisela, in 1936. Helene was arrested many times for defying the Nazi ban on Jehovah's Witness activities. During one arrest in 1937, she was beaten with rods and lost her unborn baby. Helene was convicted, condemned to death, and beheaded by guillotine on December 8, 1944 in Berlin. Gerd and Gisela survived. This is the Kuserow family in 1935. As active Jehovah's Witnesses, almost all of the adults were placed in concentration camps shortly after this photo was taken. That's Wolfgang Kuserow standing third from the left. Here he is by himself. Wolfgang was beheaded by guillotine in Brandenburg prison on March 28, 1942. He was 20 years old at the time. Most everyone is familiar with the Yellow Star of David, emblazoned with the word Jew, that the Jews of Germany and German-occupied territories were required to affix to their clothing during the era of the Holocaust so that they could be immediately identified by the authorities. But many are unaware that triangular symbols of various colors were used in a similar way by the Nazis to identify members of other persecuted groups in concentration camps. This chart shows the various categories. And here is a similar chart with the categories labeled in English. I call your attention to the purple triangle column. Yes, Jehovah's Witnesses in Nazi Germany were considered such a threat to the nation that they had their own distinguishing mark. Witness families in America were painfully aware of the persecution of their witness brethren in Germany at this time, and many indicated that one of the reasons they were standing firm on their own commitment to refuse to say the Pledge of Allegiance was their admiration for the examples of faith that the persecuted witnesses in Germany exhibited. If the German witnesses were willing to suffer and even die to stay true to the Creator and to their conscience, rather than to the dictates of the government, the least the American witnesses could do was tolerate lesser ridicule and shunning. But there was a darkness of a different kind to the American experience, including this episode from September 20th, 1942. A mob of 1,000 or so townspeople set up a war bonds sale booth just outside a building where a state convention of Jehovah's Witnesses was being held in Klamath, Oregon. They played the Star-Spangled Banner on a loudspeaker truck and shouted through the windows for the witnesses to stand up for the National Anthem. The protesters broke the windows, tore down banners, and burned stacks of church literature in the street. Some hurled eggs and stench bombs through the broken windows. When some witness men emerged and tried to push back the protesters, a battle ensued with sticks and clubs. The cars of many witnesses were overturned by the mob, which also broke into the local witnesses' headquarters, piled furniture outside, and set a second fire. A pregnant member of the church, experiencing labor pains, was rushed from the meeting building by uniformed members of the Women's Ambulance Corps. The local police chief called out his entire force, including reserve officers, to deal with the riot. To protect the women and children inside the garage, the police set off a tear gas shell outside. Note the strange difference between this event and those in Nazi Germany. In Germany, it was the national government that egged on its citizens to persecute Jehovah's Witnesses and their children over their failure to participate in prescribed national rituals. It was the national government that ultimately inflicted violence and death on them. What is so unsettling to face is the fact that in the United States at the same time, there was no national governmental stamp of approval on outright widespread persecution of witnesses, no national governmental encouragement of physical violence. No, in the land of liberty and justice for all, it wasn't governmental authorization that pressured citizens to commit acts of violence and persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses. Here, it was a grassroots nationalistic fervor, the homegrown, rabid sense of ultra-patriotism of common citizens. What is wrong with this picture? Gratefully, in 1943, the Supreme Court surprised everyone by reconsidering the topic of the pledge when another similar case was brought before it. The first time around in 1940, 7 justices had agreed with Justice Frankfurter in approving of imposing the pledge. In a reconsideration of the topic, Felix Frankfurter never changed his mind, nor did 2 of the other justices. But 5 joined Justice Stone that time around. By a 6-3 majority, the court declared that children could not be compelled by school systems to participate in the pledge. This was way too late for Lillian Gobitis to get to go back to public school, of course. She would have been 18 by then, but she did manage okay without that. After all the hoopla was over with the court cases, Lillian got on with her life, and a long life it was. She married her husband Erwin Close in 1954. Erwin was a German witness who was a concentration camp survivor, and they enjoyed 43 years of marriage before his death in 1997. Lillian died in 2014 at the age of 90 at her home in Fayetteville, Georgia. Yes, the 1943 Supreme Court decision put a damper on outright terrorism and violence, but in many quarters it didn't do much to dampen disdain by both children and adults toward those suspected of not being true patriots, especially when it comes to flag veneration. It has continued clear up to today. A Psychology Today article in 2015 titled, "Is American Patriotism Getting Out of Hand?" noted this: ugliness in the name of patriotism has occurred in the past in America. The Palmer raids and McCarthy era are easy examples, but modern times easily rival those periods, as patriotism has become increasingly zealous, immune to critical thinking, and unquestioningly militaristic. Reverence for patriotic symbols has become paramount in America as citizens place ribbon magnets on their SUVs and political candidates are questioned when they fail to wear a flag on their lapel. Such gestures are easy to make. A candidate with a flag pin, after all, is hardly exhibiting political courage. And even a terrorist could put a yellow ribbon on his vehicle, but nevertheless they are seen as evidence of true patriotism. And even the pledge issue has never gone away, in spite of that 1943 Supreme Court ruling. As just one example, in 2013, a Florida teacher insisted that a Jehovah's Witness 4th grade boy participate in the pledge during a September 11th commemoration, and she forcibly placed his hand over his heart, just as Billy Gobitis' teacher had attempted to do in 1935. When he resisted, she chastised him in front of the class, saying, "You are an American, and you are supposed to salute the flag. In my classroom, everyone will do the pledge. No religion says you can't do the pledge. If you can't put your hand on your heart, then you need to move out of the country." Gratefully, this time around, it was the teacher who got in trouble for the incident, not the child. Florida state law is very clear on the rights of children in such instances, based squarely on the Supreme Court ruling of 1943. The teacher's ignorance of those rights earned her a 5-day suspension. But her attitude toward the extreme importance of civic rituals involving the flag and agitation against those who don't participate has not been an isolated one in many areas of the country. And of course, it is not just aimed at Jehovah's Witnesses. There are others who have personal matters of conscience regarding such ceremonies, and they are equally scorned by many when they respectfully refrain from participation. Thus, here we are, 75 years later, and still dealing with grassroots disdain by many folks towards anyone whom they don't think suitably patriotic enough by their own standards. Only this time around, the grassroots is being egged on by no less a person of influence than the President of the United States, as seen in this excerpt from Vanity Fair magazine in May 2018. What seemed like every Sunday, Monday, and Thursday during the season, Trump logged onto Twitter to rant about how supposedly shameful it was for players protesting racial inequality not to stand during the anthem. If a player wants the privilege of making millions of dollars in the NFL or other leagues, he or she should not be allowed to disrespect our great American flag or country and should stand for the national anthem. If not, you're fired, he wrote in late September. Sports fans should never condone players that do not stand proud for their national anthem or their country. NFL should change policy, he tweeted a day later, followed by a pronouncement that The issue of kneeling has nothing to do with race. It is about respect for our country, flag, and national anthem. NFL must respect this. In 1940, President Roosevelt had attempted to calm the angry mobs, pleading, "It is pitifully easy to crush out freedom in an overzealous attempt to preserve it." In 2017, President Trump had eagerly attempted to inflame the anger of the mobs, telling his supporters at a rally in Alabama, September 22nd.
Wouldn't you love to see one of these NFL owners, when somebody disrespects our flag, to say, "Get that son of a bitch off the field right now, out, he's fired. He's fired!"
Yes, Donald Trump has made embracing profession of allegiance to the flag as an absolute requirement for proof of patriotism. And in a 2018 interview, he even implied there should perhaps be an even more drastic punishment for anyone flouting the flag ritual than loss of employment. He hinted at perhaps deporting them. "You have to stand proudly for national anthem or shouldn't be playing. You shouldn't be there. Maybe you shouldn't be in the country." Asked if Trump considered he deserved credit for being the one pushing forward this rabid civic patriotic agenda in the land, this absolute need for this solemn, practically sacred respect for the flag, he said, "I think the people pushed it forward. This was not me. I brought it out. This country is very smart. We have very smart people." Yes, indeed, the descendants of the same very smart people who knew how to deal with people they considered unpatriotic in 1940. It is sobering to think that the same irrational impulses that stirred up those smart people way back then to commit callous and vicious acts of injustice could raise its ugly head again in the 21st century, to stir up a new generation to indulge in such un-American activities, all in the name of patriotism.